is happening in schools today? What is happening in schools today is the result of what has been happening for quite a while. What has been happening for quite a while? Well, for a long time, schools have supposedly been teaching us how to think. And today, they're supposedly telling us what to think. How to think is supposed to be better than what to think. And yet, how is it that we have come from one to another? Well, in a few words, we can understand what has happened and what the sole alternative, the sole way out is. What has happened? How have we shifted from one scenario to another? From schools that taught us how to think, presumably, to schools that teach us what to think, presumably. How to think suggests a method. Schools teach you a method, a strategy, a form, or a format that then entitles you, enables you, empowers you to think things themselves. You can choose what to think of things, of reality, based on the method, by applying the method to reality. Now you know how to approach reality. The school tells you how to approach reality, how to face life. It prepares you for life. How does it prepare you for life? By teaching you a method, a way to cross the street, a way to live. That method is learned, supposedly, in schools. But schools here are somewhat cut off from life. In the respect that they're just teaching you the method, they're not teaching you life. The method is an abstract entity. How can somebody otherwise teach me how to think? Am I even thinking? Who is thinking? What is thinking? What is thought? That question is too philosophical for ordinary schools, which must limit themselves, or so it happened up to not long ago, to telling us how to think, what method, how to adopt, how to go about thinking, what path to follow in order to think. Do we need one? Or perhaps we are to be told to think. Is thinking one thing, and then we have the method on the other side? Can we teach anyone how to think? What does it mean to think? What does it mean to teach someone how to think? Is thinking something that we are taught by someone else? Well, thinking might have its conditions for us. In other words, we might need discipline So we're taught discipline so that we may think better because we have discipline. And so we think better, assuming that thinking is what we do. And of course, the notion that we are thinkers, that we are things that think, is Cartesian. It goes back to René Descartes, at the very least. Descartes notoriously spoke of man as an ego who is res cogitans, that is to say, a thinking thing, the thing that thinks. So now, Descartes can give us a method that helps us do what we do it well. He helps us correct our ways so that we may be ourselves more, shall we say, authentically, or in a better way. Is this what schools are supposed to do? That, I think, for the most part, makes sense, I think. And yet, there is a problem that arises from this. A difficulty. For thinking is a fundamental question. Is thinking something that requires a medium? What is that medium? Well, in classical times, it was understood to be language, the art of speech. It is through language that we begin to think, or that we expose ourselves to thought. And so to that extent, we make thoughts our own. We say that we think because we expose ourselves to thought, to mind, to the life of the mind, to the vital questions of life through speech. So schools, in this respect, should help us learn how to speak well. Now that makes sense. Schools teach us how to think in the respect that they teach us how to speak. But if schools are supposed to teach us how to think in another sense, a less poetic sense, a more scientific sense, whereby schools give us a method of inquiry, teach us a strategy to ask questions, to investigate in a certain way. Of course, we are all familiar with the scientific method, which tells us how to go about discovering things, analyzing things, solving problems. Then we have another problem that arises, which is that we have learned a method without learning anything other than the method. Schools empower us to go out there and confront the world by applying the method. Now, this has precious little to do with the classical, ancient even, understanding of schools as teaching us the art of speech and all of the qualities that go along with it. The art of speech allows us to transcend fears in the direction of thought. Speaking well is not just to ornate life. Speaking well is to expose ourselves and our mortality to what is behind the mask of things, what is behind the appearance of the world, and our own appearances. Well, where schools became places where children, students of all ages, were taught the method to apply, what we had was places where nobody's addressing the actual content of life, if only tangentially, perhaps, it would be addressed as a problem. Huh? But now one can see easily, I think, that where schools are focused almost entirely on methods, they could, of course, consider the world as bits and pieces that are extrapolated from it in order to test the method. But essentially what they're teaching is the method. Then we could have a reaction against that. There comes a point where teachers, students themselves, could react against that habit of understanding education as centered upon methods. And we could say that we need to get into the water. Enough with the manual, we need to start swimming. We need to start facing real problems out there. And schools ought to adapt to the new demands, to face the problems out there. Bracket the question of method. Now you jump into the water. We've heard enough about how to swim and the various techniques on paper. We need to start swimming. We need to start going out there, becoming, perhaps today we would say, activists. Jump in the water. Start living. And so schools will tell you at this point no longer how to think, but what to think. They say, look, that's what you have to do. This is what you have to do. They won't tell you, step back and analyze. They'll tell you that the time for analysis is past, is up. We're at the end of the road, and now it's time to jump into the water. It is time to swim. It is time to make decisions about what is right and wrong. What is right is this, what is wrong is that. Now we can say it. Is it scientific? Well, the old school of scientists could have sworn that science is not concerned with value judgments. Do not judge. The new school tells you you must judge immediately. And how are we to judge? What's the standard? Where is the method? The standard has become the society today. The universal society is the standard. Whatever fits is good. Whatever doesn't fit is bad. What is the story about this universal society? Well, the universal society is universal because it transcends old morality, old conceptions of good and evil. The modern society ultimately is to be universal technologically. There is a new medium, which is technology, which mediates all facets of our existence. and transforms our existence in function of that medium itself. So life becomes technological. All problems are approached as mechanical problems. In fact, all problems are mediated by technology. Indeed, one has a hard time trying to figure out if they're just mediated or if they're actually created entirely by technology. Now, the older school of education objects that we should just focus on, or primarily focus on, the methods. That, indeed, ultimately, what we know in terms of content is empty. That what is important is the method. That is what you know. The rest is just opinions. Good and evil is a matter of opinions. But the method, that's something that you can know clearly and distinctly. That's what schools are supposed to be teaching you. The method to think, to correct your ways of thinking. Assuming that you have any. Again, the ancient, shall we say, approach to this question is the poetic one, which has evidently a rhetorical nature. So you're learning how to speak well. And by speaking well, you expose yourself to thought, to what transcends your physicality. The modern, and yet older with respect to today, school tells us that the ancients, reminds us that the ancients taught that knowledge is ultimately knowledge of ignorance. Knowledge is therefore to show us the limitations of knowledge. But here there is a misunderstanding of the classical lesson, the ancient lesson. For when the ancients, Socrates is paradigmatic, but you could go to others. When the ancients suggest that we are to know ignorance, they're not setting the stage for a Cartesian method. On the contrary, they're opening us, they're inviting us to expose ourselves to a fundamental alternative to that method. What is that alternative? Well, if true knowledge is knowledge of ignorance, that is to be understood, the proposition is to be understood as suggesting that ordinary knowledge does not confront itself, so a vulgar conception of knowledge, does not pertain to the context of knowledge. But now, that context is not limited to what, shall we say, Philistines and anti-intellectuals might assume it is. Existential forces, power games, and so forth, that are at play outside of the methods. What is beyond our knowledge understood, conceived in vulgar terms, discrete knowledge, acquisitions, and of course in the most degraded sense, information that we grasp that we collect, acquire. What is beyond that is what we don't know in vulgar terms. So how do we confront the world that is outside of what we know in the vulgar sense of the term? And the answer is by letting go. Just as you know things in a vulgar sense by grasping things. So look at all this knowledge that I have, that I possess, because I've accumulated it by grasping. You know ignorance where you let go, to the extent that you let go. So ultimately, what is to be let go of is yourself, of course. Now, when you let go of yourself as the grasper, knowledge is something else. It is no longer the object of acquisition, of grasping, but the object of letting go. A gift. When you let go, you open your hand and you receive the gift. This is the core of what Aristotle proposes. And a good man once spoke of Aristotle as the first phenomenologist. Someone who is waiting to see things, waiting to hear. You wait, you open yourself to receive what is actually there. Now, knowledge of ignorance, properly or classically understood, is precisely that. It is knowledge of that which transcends the objects of knowledge, of the context within which the context of knowledge, of ordinary vulgar knowledge, is situated. That broader context is the context of letting go. Today's schools reject that context altogether. In rejecting it, they're left with these two options. You either build methods and teach the methods that allow students to see the world. So you take a sheet of paper, you cut a shape within it, and you see everything through that shape. So I could write, or I could carve the word capital in, or power, in the sheet, and then see the whole world through that sheet, through those holes, and say, power, capital, lust, this is what I see everywhere. Or I can give up this enterprise. You say, well, jump in the water. No. Retain the qualities of good speech. Trust your teachers who have taught you how to speak well, your fathers, paradigmatically, the good models of rhetoric, of good rhetoric, that comes along with, obvious qualities. To speak well, you must learn how to wait, how to listen, how to let go. And good speech becomes the vehicle for good thought, for real thought, and thus for knowledge of ignorance, being knowledge of all that is beyond our reaches, our grasping capacities. All that we cannot grasp is what ultimately is at once knowledge and the known. What can be done about schools today? How can they transcend this stage of development that they find themselves in, where they become agendas, where schools tell us what to do and teach us opinions about the world. And so some will say that they teach us what to think. In this sense, they mean what to believe. Returning to a method won't suffice. We would need to get back to good rhetoric, teaching how to speak well. How do we teach that? By looking at the models, the great models of earlier ages, when people gave a lot of importance to that. So we return to our great authors, those who spoke well, and they will help us once again expose ourselves to thought, to a horizon of life, of reality, that transcends the compulsion to grasp. Therein, on that horizon, shall we discover once again happiness.